Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's lung cancer living room. Thank you all for being here. I'm Danielle Hicks, for those of you who may not know me. I am Chief Patient Officer at Go-To Foundation for Lung Cancer, and I love my job because it allows me to be able to interact with all of you. Not only the people who are living with lung cancer right now, but their caregivers, their loved ones, their friends, their family. You are all family to us. Tonight we're talking about the new age of small cell lung cancer and the hope and advancements that have been made fairly recently. In particular, when we're talking about a lot of the conversations we have in this living room, as most of you who are veterans know, revolves around non-small cell lung cancer because a lot has happened in the last decade and a half or so in that space. And the very, very good news is that those exciting things are starting to happen in the small cell lung cancer space. So there's a lot of hope to be found in this sort of area right now. I'm thrilled to have with me Dr. Jacob Sands. For those of you, again, who are veterans, you know he is also a veteran to this meeting. Dr. Sands is a medical oncologist at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and he's a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. So he comes with really great credentials, but an even bigger heart. So I could not be happier to have him here tonight to be talking about real advances in small cell lung cancer, but the hope and what's available right now and what that looks like. And I think one of the exciting things, and one of the things that you and I had talked about, just for a little sort of overview, prior to this, you and I had talked about more things are happening in small cell lung cancer right now than have really happened in the last 4 or 5 decades. So as I said to someone earlier, there was sort of this sort of same old, if someone was diagnosed, there was a very specific treatment regimen, right? And now there are options. There are options for treatments, and that's what I'm really, really excited to talk about tonight. But before we jump into that, I think because we do have a mix of non-small cell and small cell folks in the room, and I'm sure online, can we start just sort of by describing what the differences are between the two?
Yeah, I'll explain it, but I also think that this is a common thing where, especially when the diagnosis is not yet known and we're getting the biopsy or we're waiting for biopsy results, patients will say, well, which one is better? And I say, look, you know, we're not choosing. It just is what it is. And so the comparison, I don't know, we'll mention it, but it's not the point. The point is that people have what they have, and that's where we're starting from. Now, small cell lung cancer tends to be a diagnosis that grows very rapidly. Now, the good news is that at the time of diagnosis, the treatment tends to work exceptionally well. And so the tumor shrinks very quickly with chemotherapy. It shrinks very quickly with radiation. The challenge is that at progression, when it grows again down the line, it's kind of a different diagnosis than at the beginning. Now, there's some nuance to that as far as expectations in the next line. Generally speaking, the targeted therapies that we talk about with non-small cell lung cancer, the pills that some people are on, are rarely something that's relevant to small cell lung cancer. We can discuss that a little bit. The paradigm of treatment and the expectations or the scenarios are a bit different between non-small cell and small cell. But you know, talking about non-small cell is like, okay, well, are we talking about certain genomic alterations? Are we talking about something with a high PD-L1? Those are different diagnoses in themselves. And so I guess that kind of just introduces the idea that everybody with a lung cancer, although we kind of bucket those into common categories, and we talk about those often as if it's all the same, it's not. If we took any lung cancer, and we looked at all the mutations that exist, there probably aren't 2 that are identical. You know, we might say a lot of people with an adenocarcinoma, even adenocarcinoma with an EGFR mutation, getting very specific, those aren't all acting the same. There's a broad range of how those may act. And same thing with small cell lung cancer. So even these comparisons between different tumor types are an overview that is not necessarily an acknowledgement of the fact that each of these are unique in themselves. And which means that the most common question I get is kind of something related to, well, how is this gonna go? How long is the treatment gonna work for? How long am I gonna live? These types of questions. They're impossible to answer. There's broad range of possibilities. And we can discuss some of that. I think the challenge for any one individual when I'm talking to them is it can feel a lot like I'm sidestepping questions, but you really can't know. So then when you're talking about comparing non-small cell and small cell, it's an important question as far as kind of setting the frame of things, but as far as any one individual's experience with their diagnosis, that's a different topic.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, and I think what Dr. Sands is talking about is really this personalized medicine, and no two lung cancers are the same, up to, but not just including what type of lung cancer, right? Non-small cell lung cancer is the most common,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But underneath that umbrella of non-small cell lung cancer, with the development of driver mutations, and you touched on this a little bit, we have created a subset of very rare, honestly, types of lung cancer within that bucket. And where small cell lung cancer, as a general umbrella, used to be the smaller, now because of how this is all parsed down, that's not necessarily the case anymore.
Right.
And I think that's where I've seen, and this is my opinion, but we've seen this sort of shift in research being done, particularly in small cell lung cancer, where all of a sudden a community of people diagnosed with small cell lung cancer that was largely neglected, might be a strong word, but not a ton of money was put into research for this subset of patients. Whereas now,
That's true. Although I think it's more that it's just been a very challenging diagnosis. Because the science is moving faster and faster. So things like knowing that DLL3, a receptor that is common on small cell lung cancer, is a target that is valid. And there are multiple drugs being developed now that target DLL3 in different ways that have shown promising results. And so I think as the science has sped up, it's given us more information for how better to create these different drugs that will effectively treat small cell lung cancer. To the point you said, there are more drugs in development now for small cell lung cancer than the culmination of all prior studies for small cell. There is a boom of science going on right now.
Yeah, there really is. And I shared with someone earlier that, 15 or so years ago when I started going to ASCO, which those of you in the room, and I'm sure those of you who are veterans online are familiar with, which is the big American Society of Clinical Oncology, the big annual cancer conference that happens in Chicago every year. Back when I first started going, I would walk through the convention hall, and I was hard-pressed to find a lot of people working in lung cancer anywhere, right? And then that has grown into, you're hard-pressed to find anybody who's not. And now similarly with small cell lung cancer, you're hard-pressed to find these big, large pharmaceutical companies who are not diving deep into it. We'll come back to the DLL3 because Dr. Sands mentioned it, but first, let's talk a little bit about staging for small cell lung cancer, because it differs a little bit from how we stage other types of lung cancer.
Yes and no. Yes, the way that we broadly do it, there is still kind of the stage 1 through 4 for kind of more nuanced clinical trials, research aspects. But broadly speaking, how you treat small cell lung cancer is largely either a single nodule and plus minus one lymph node that's really out to the periphery that might be treated with surgery, followed by chemotherapy. More broadly, and that's an uncommon scenario, this is something that would be more commonly picked up in something like lung screening. Inherent to this topic is mentioning lung screening, which maybe we can come back to make sure we touch on. More commonly, though, limited stage ends up being a lung mass and lymph nodes, often in the middle of the chest, but nothing beyond. And if it's all limited within that area, it's considered potentially curable, and it is treated aggressively with chemotherapy and radiation. Now, everyone here and online may already know this, but usually when I'm seeing someone in the office and they've just been diagnosed and we're talking about chemotherapy, I'll often make the comment that many people picture that with chemotherapy, they're going to be laid up in bed vomiting without hair. And often people respond, well, that's exactly what I thought it meant. And now the chemotherapy for small cell, people do lose their hair. But thankfully, this whole idea of being laid up vomiting really broadly does not happen. Our anti-nausea medications are so good that that's not typically an issue. Now, it's not saying it can't be, but broadly speaking, it's not often what people picture. So the chemotherapy with radiation is the way that that's treated. Now, a separate topic is radiation to the brain, which we can potentially touch on. That's become a bit more nuanced and is certainly worth discussing with a radiation oncologist, whether or not to get radiation after finishing chemotherapy in extensive stage or chemotherapy and radiation in limited stage in both of those. But that would be the treatment for limited stage. Now, extensive stage, we've had a big advance, really about 5 years ago at this point, Now, extensive stage is spread beyond the chest, essentially, or too much to fit within one radiation field. So it's more than you could encompass with that very aggressive treatment we talked about, chemotherapy and radiation. And that is now treated with chemotherapy plus immunotherapy. Now, immunotherapy has been revolutionary, not in the treatment of everybody, unfortunately, but a subset of individuals that really have ongoing, extraordinary disease control in some cases. And I'll go so far as to say, I think that there are some individuals that are actually cured of this incurable diagnosis when it is stage 4, when it has spread, with the incorporation of immunotherapy. We see people that are sometimes many years now out. Now, first approved about 5 years ago. I think we need another 10 years before we can really say what kind of long-term control, because people just started getting it 5 years ago. But we do see people that are years in from initial diagnosis now.
So you talked about the brain, and I can't remember whether or not you and I discussed this before this meeting, but I know from my own experience working with people who were diagnosed with small cell lung cancer, quite often historically, something was recommended called prophylactic cranial irradiation, where, well, I'm going to go ahead and let the doctor explain what this is and where that stands sort of today.
Yeah, so this is what's gotten so much more nuanced. And this is where, I mean, everyone should have an individual discussion with a radiation oncologist about this for your scenarios. But broadly speaking, historically there were studies in limited stage and extensive stage. Those are the two stages we discussed, of people who half the group got radiation to the brain, half the group did not. Now it's called prophylactic cranial irradiation, prophylactic radiation to the brain. Prophylactic being no evidence, no known cancer in the brain, but this kind of preventative. Preventative is not quite the right term, because what it's really doing is treating microscopic disease, so something that you can't see on a scan. Now, in these historical studies, the group that got the radiation did better, lived longer. But in those trials, there was not an MRI of the brain before randomizing to which group. And nowadays, MRI brain is very standard. So more recently, there was a study in Japan that looked at individuals that had extensive stage, so metastatic stage 4. Half them got radiation and half of them got observation with every 3-month MRI brain. Now, of the group that did not get the radiation, they were more likely to later need radiation, which makes sense. Everyone in the other group got it. They were more likely to later need it, but the outcomes actually were not so different. And so this raised the question of, well, maybe those historical studies, the fact that there wasn't an MRI done, meant that there were people who, had there been MRI done, you would have seen that there was disease in the brain, and therefore it was very much therapeutic, it was very much treatment, and not prophylactic so much. And so there's a study in the US right now, in limited stage and in extensive stage. And often what I'll tell patients is, hey, when you talk to the radiation oncologist, after that nuanced discussion, if you feel strongly that you want to get the radiation, you can get it. That's justified. If you feel strongly that you do not want radiation, well, that's often justified too. And if you're not sure and you say flip a coin, well then participate in the trial, because then you are assigned to one or the other. But if you have a preference, then you can choose that. And it's worth having that nuanced discussion though about anyone's specific scenario with a radiation oncologist.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important time maybe to sort of interject, or a relevant time to interject, the importance of having the conversation with your healthcare providers, whether it's your medical oncologist, your radiologist, your radiation oncologist, like whoever you're having this conversation with. It's important that you educate and empower yourself to be able to have these informed conversations, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know that you should be talking to Doc X, Y, or Z about X, Y, or Z unless you know what X, Y, or Z actually are. And so I think that's an important thing that we try to do in this living room and in other program areas across GoTo, is bring you this information. And when we're talking about this prophylactic sort of, cranial irradiation, that's a big decision, because radiating the entire brain does not come without its own potential set of, issues.
That's right. Now, there have been some advances. The way that radiation is done now is a bit different than the way it was done before. They now spare areas of memory. There are some drugs that can help prevent some of the side effects too. I think it's often a much scarier kind of an idea than the experience of it, meaning, we're talking about radiation to the brain just as a concept is often a scary kind of idea. But there are some real potential side effects as well, and you can't always predict exactly how that will go for everybody. And so, I often will make the analogy when talking about the side effects of chemotherapy or immunotherapy, but relevant with radiation too, is saying, if I ask you what'll happen on my drive home, not to say that a drive home is the same thing as as a cancer treatment, but just to make the analogy, what'll happen on my drive home, you'd probably say, well, you'll be fine, maybe hit some traffic. Traffic in Boston's awful. Traffic in San Francisco, I know, is awful too. So you might hit some traffic, but you'll be fine. And I'm like, well, what are all the things that can happen?
Yeah.
Now that becomes a really long, scary list of possibilities. Now, broadly speaking with radiation, again, not that it's the same thing, there are some toxicities that are more common than others, but what can happen becomes this long, scary list. But you need to balance that out with what is the true benefit, and that's what we're saying is, well, there's now more study to be done to better define this.
Yeah, and I think it's a goals of care conversation, right? Not that I want to make this a whole disparities in healthcare conversation, but it's also an understanding. You mentioned what I think you're referring to as hippocampal sparing whole brain radiation, which is great, but not always an option depending upon where this treatment is being offered. So understanding that that's even a thing, to be able to have that conversation to say, hey, is this something A, that is good for me, and B, do you have the technology to make this happen, right? I don't want to scare anybody off from radiation therapy, because radiation therapy is amazing for a lot of reasons, right? Up to and including, surgery on patients who can't, otherwise have surgery or
It's
palliatively.
often pretty anticlimactic. When people go and lay on a table for 5 minutes and you don't feel anything. But this is where having that discussion with a radiation oncologist will matter. Now, I actually don't know the numbers. I don't know if hippocampal sparing is available in some and not others. But talking, what is the risk? What percentages are we talking about? What are they expecting? What is the likelihood of something showing up given your particular scenario? If you didn't get radiation, what would they anticipate? There's no way of being perfect on that, but we can speculate as to saying highly likely, less likely type scenarios.
And sorry, I didn't mean to get caught up on PCI, but it does come up a lot where patients feel like they're sort of forced into a decision without really understanding what that decision is being made for. So thank you for that. How is it determined, and is this also a shared decision conversation, or how do you determine whether somebody gets chemo, radiation, chemo IO? How do you decide what that therapy looks like?
Well, the staging, as you started with, is really the first. So if you're talking about limited stage, then the treatment goal is cure, and that's chemo radiation. Now, there were studies done that incorporated immunotherapy. We don't yet have the results of those. I'm optimistic that that's going to show positive results, but we'll have to see. I don't know when that data will be available, but I can't imagine it'll be too much longer before we get something. But right now, chemotherapy and radiation together, and then you talk about radiation to the brain, prophylactic cranial irradiation. For metastatic disease, for stage 4, then it's chemotherapy plus immunotherapy. Now, there are certain other diagnoses that could make it very high risk for giving immunotherapy. These are things like autoimmune diseases. So if someone is seeing a rheumatologist and on treatment for some kind of autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, things like this, then in those cases, the immunotherapy might not be recommended. That being said, if the diagnosis is something that for years has not required any active management, then maybe the immunotherapy could still be utilized. And that gets into some specifics that really requires meeting with your doctor to talk about those.
Yeah. Michelle, I think you have a question online.
How does non-small cell lung cancer that has transformed to small cell react with different treatments such as immunotherapy? Would it be different if the cancer that started as small cell?
So that's a great question. And there is increasing amounts of research around non-small cell that has transformed to small cell. So to explain that. This is something where the diagnosis is non-small cell. Now, commonly, or more commonly in that case, it's an EGFR mutation, so a type of adenocarcinoma that's been treated with targeted therapy, although it can happen with others, where part of the resistance to that drug, where the cancer starts growing despite the treatment, is because it transformed. And it went from non-small cell to small cell. Now, that is something that we don't have nearly the amount of research in that specific population as we do with small cell lung cancer at initial diagnosis. But the research that we have really suggests a lot of similarities. So the DLL3 expression that I mentioned, that is also seen in these EGFR transformed or becoming small cell lung cancer. The small cell lung cancer drugs, the initial drugs we utilize tend to work. As far as getting into some more specifics though, we don't have a lot of the specifics as far as what percentage of people do immunotherapy work. I don't know that we have enough numbers to really be able to confidently say that. As far as next lines of therapy, this is really an area of ongoing research. So right now we largely treat those individuals like a small cell lung cancer, certainly on the initial diagnosis. Whether or not to incorporate immunotherapy, there's discussion around. I think sometimes people will continue the targeted therapy in some cases and then add in chemotherapy. In others, they'll give just the chemotherapy, and then in others, it'll be the chemo and immunotherapy. I can hear that answer sounding kind of like, well then, what do we do? And that's the research. So I do think immunotherapy is still an important consideration in that population. If you're doing targeted therapy in that EGFR specific case, you cannot do immunotherapy because the combination can cause real risk of side effects. But at some point, getting treated with immunotherapy I still think is very important, even if not in the initial treatment.
I want to jump into, we talked a little bit earlier about, you talked about chemotherapy and people's fears around they're going to feel horrible, they're not going to be able to get out of bed, they're going to lose their hair, they're going to be throwing up all the time. And let's talk a little bit about supportive or palliative care,
Yeah.
and what that is, what role it plays, and when it should become part of someone's treatment plan.
Over the last, I'd say especially 10 years, but even before, so Dr. Tamil out of MGH published a study in the New England Journal of Medicine with early incorporation of palliative care, and really just showed that outcomes were across the board better. People did better as far as symptoms, people lived longer, which was the aspect of that was less intuitive to me. So across the board did better, which really kind of kickstarted this early incorporation of palliative care. Now that being said, maybe the first, before even diving further into that, is what is palliative care? Because people have such different ideas around that. Some people have heard of palliative care only associated with hospice, and so they think of palliative care as end-of-life care. And palliative care certainly is often involved in end-of-life care, but that's not all. And so I will often, when discussing this with individuals, if the word palliative care, I can see the room start spinning around them, as I'll say, we also could call it supportive oncology. And supportive oncology, it kind of communicates more that this is another part of the team in your treatment. And so palliative care can help a lot with symptom control. And sometimes they can also help people kind of get their feet on the ground a little more too. I'll say one of the things that drove me into oncology is I don't think that there's another field in medicine that incorporates or kind of pulls in the whole person as much as oncology. It is not just the body and the disease, but the mind and emotions and all of this. And so often when people are diagnosed, I can see during their office visit, the room is just spinning around them. And one of the things I really focus on is how to help people kind of get their feet on the ground enough that we can talk about it in a more tangible way. And I think palliative care can help with some of that as well. I see from the patient experience, just in what I'm observing in people when they come in, Oftentimes the discussion with the medical oncologist, the discussion will be a little different than when talking with other team members. I think often with nurses, patients tend to be a bit more explicit about their experiences. They'll discuss the side effects a bit more. Often with the oncologist, I see individuals not wanting the doctor to hold back or wanting to make sure they're getting everything. So they say, everything's fine, just keep it up. And so having these different team members that can kind of interact with the patients and the different aspects of their truth of what they're going through and put those pieces together to really treat that individual the best can be extremely valuable. Hopefully that's all making sense, because this is kind of an intangible topic, but there's mentioned sometimes that doctors they kind of talk over patients, and there's this idea out there. And I think we all experience life in an emotional way, especially with something as big as cancer. That's a very emotional experience. And so when you get the doctors coming in and just kind of talking the intellectual or talking the facts or the objective, sometimes those don't quite connect. And so these other team members that can kind of incorporate the whole experience and then have a shared coordinated group care can be extremely valuable. So palliative care engages more on this as well, but also any symptoms that you're experiencing. So things like nausea, if that is more of a problem, things like pain, if that is a problem, other types of symptoms, they'll be very focused on some of those and can often add to that. I do not tend to involve palliative care for all patients, but I think in somebody who's having symptoms, I am more attentive to the idea that it might not be as well controlled as I think, and if I have any hint that there's maybe something more that could be added within that, then I'll incorporate palliative care in those cases.
Quality of life is a big issue here, right? When we're talking about potential side effects and the supportive care to help improve quality of life. And I think this kind of circles back around to another thing that I want to talk about again, because I've heard patients or people diagnosed over the years calling the helpline because they're in trouble over nausea, over diarrhea, they can't eat, they can't, right? And we are like, call your healthcare provider, but they're terrified that by calling, that means you or their treating physician is going to take them off a treatment that they believe is killing their cancer. And that's a very terrifying, I think, place. And I see nodding heads, and I know a lot of folks kind of feel that way. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of when to start sharing this information with your physicians and how you can maybe mitigate the issues by having those conversations?
Yeah, this is such an important topic. And I think it's important you see your doctor as your team member. It seems natural to kind of have an idea of what one thinks should happen or have a strong belief that because they want that thing, then this is what should happen to get there. You know, the treatment strategy that's not your role in it. Of course, you are the voice, you are the director in all of this. But the expertise of the oncologist is really what you're leaning on to get there. I'll often give the analogy in clinic. It's kind of like I'm the tour guide on the vacation you never wanted to take. You know, you're on vacation, and if you say, hey, I really want to see the monkeys, you know, with a tour guide, you'd say, we want to see monkeys. Now, you know, the tour guide can't guarantee you that that's what you're going to see unless you're at a zoo, but the tour guide will know where to go to see the monkeys. You don't say, hey, I insist, I want to go that way, because I just feel like that's where the monkeys are. And hopefully that analogy kind of helps in saying, okay, you want to, in many cases, have as good a quality of life for as long as possible. That's what most people broadly want. And so the discussion with the oncologist is, I want good quality of life for as long as I can. And they'll say, that's typically what we're doing. And so then you being very honest about what you are experiencing helps your oncologist to then shape the treatment for that. So when someone is just trying to really just push through these treatments because they believe that by pushing through them they're going to get something, but they're withholding that from their oncologist, they're not giving the oncologist the information that that oncologist needs to actually get to those goals. I think one of the most challenging but most important jobs of an oncologist is to be able to see in patients when they're holding very strongly held beliefs that they don't necessarily understand our beliefs. So this example of saying, well, I believe that with this treatment, I need to be getting the full dose all the time on schedule. And so I'm not gonna tell my oncologist, or I'll just deal with it myself when some of these things are going on. Well, is that true? I mean, does that actually get you the longest quality of life? Or does that put you at higher risk of complications? Well, that's the thing to balance out. And your oncologist can only really do that if he or she really knows all the information. And so you are that, like I said, I'm the tour guide on the tour you never wanted to take, but here we are. And so I think it's important for patients to, one, know that this is your life. Anything you say or request or ask is valid. And the medical teams should take it that way. And so you ask them anything you want, you let them know your goals, what you want, and then you trust them. And if you don't, then you have the wrong oncologist. But if you trust them, then you share what's going on with you, and you as a team then work toward what it is your goal is.
Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in research and what the data is showing.
So this is mostly in metastatic, although I mentioned limited stage incorporating immunotherapy has been done, those trials have been done, and we should have data sometime in the near future, I would expect. So we're now going to talk in extensive stage, so stage 4. So chemotherapy plus immunotherapy is the standard of care. And like I said, immunotherapy is, for a subset of individuals, is leading to years of disease control. And I still have, I have a patient that I treated on one of these trials. So she's now more than 5 years from when she was initially diagnosed, has not been on anything now for years at this point. And some of these really extraordinary outcomes we're seeing. But it's not everybody. And unfortunately, it's just a subset of individuals. So the research is really more so after that point. After that point, the newest drug was from a few years ago. There's a drug called lurbinectedin. This is another chemotherapy. This is a once every 3-week drug. So I think the schedule is good. It's not a home run. It's a step. It's another drug. It's another step in the incorporation of others. More novel therapies right now are really multiple that target DLL3. So as I mentioned, DLL3 is a receptor on the surface of many small cell lung cancers. There was an initial drug which unfortunately was not quite effective enough and caused too much in the way of side effects in the past. But that one targeted DLL3. It delivered chemo essentially to drugs with that DLL3 receptor. And it really showed that this is in fact something that exists on these cells. There is probably the furthest along is a drug called tarlatamab, but this is a drug that binds DLL3 and binds immune cells, pulling them together, creating an immune response. And this, like the other immunotherapy, we're seeing a subset of individuals that really have extraordinary outcomes, long-term disease control with this drug. There are others in that class as well now. And so there are multiple of these drugs that bind the cancer cells and bind immune cells, pulling them together. There are other drugs now being developed that have a different target for the immune cells, so it brings in a different kind of cell from the immune system, along with the cancer cell to again create an immune response. There are drugs called antibody-drug conjugates. So this is a drug that binds a receptor on the surface of the cancer cells, and it pulls that drug in where it releases the chemotherapy inside the cell. So it's kind of like a targeted chemotherapy that then is treating these. And there are multiple different receptors now for small cell lung cancer that are being utilized in this way. So different ways of essentially accessing or utilizing like doors to small cell lung cancer to be able to deliver the chemotherapy into the cells. There are other drugs that hit different pathways. And on top of this, I'm kind of not naming all of them because I don't know if all the names matter as much as just the classes. So the other thing that overlays small cell lung cancer now is this framework of, can we subtype small cell lung cancer? So non-small cell lung cancer, we talk about adenocarcinoma, we talk about squamous cell carcinoma, and there are other less common ones. Within small cell lung cancer, it's just been all small cell lung cancer. But what we see is that there are probably 4 broad subtypes of small cell lung cancer. Now, those have been defined, and how best to test those in a way that's really scalable, I think, still needs to be sorted out a bit. What those mean, there's a lot of ideas about how those might affect treatment outcomes if we were to take a drug in development and say, wow, well, it tends to work better for this subtype than others. And we really focus the treatment on that subtype. And so this is something that's really being looked at within studies as well, as far as better defining what the clinical meaning of those subtypes is, how that would affect the treatment outcomes, and then the development of some of these drugs relevant to those subtypes is really an ongoing area of study.
When is the right time for the person diagnosed with small cell lung cancer to start thinking about or having conversations with their healthcare providers about clinical trials?
Right at the beginning. So small cell lung cancer tends to grow rapidly. So it's not necessarily something where you want to wait, but that doesn't mean you can't. When someone's having symptoms, particularly the more severe the symptoms, the more rapidly you really need to start treatment. So there's a balance here. If it's going to take a month to see somebody, you need to get started. If you're interested in a trial, when you contact one of the academic centers to say, I have small cell lung cancer, I want to be seen, it's good to highlight, I haven't yet gotten treatment and I'm interested in trials. It's possible that will kind of then fast track you for the oncologist that is running these trials, that's writing these trials, to then say, oh, we've got these research slots. I mean, I don't know. Because small cell lung cancer is something that cannot wait for treatment, whether somebody has initially not started initial treatment or later line treatments, if they call into Dana-Farber to say they want to be seen for small cell lung cancer, the schedulers contact me immediately to say this person is not on therapy. If somebody's on therapy, sometimes someone has just started treatment and they want to get a second opinion. Well, the first line treatment is pretty standard. And so almost always I'll say, this is what I would give you here, and I encourage them, this is great treatment. You can get this with your oncologist, and I encourage them to continue to get treatment with their oncologist. And I say, at the time where it grows, I will get you back in very urgently, because to be able to discuss clinical trials, you can't yet have started a treatment. I make sure we fast track everybody in to have this discussion. But for someone who's been diagnosed, the treatment you're going to get at every center is likely very similar, if not the same thing. But it's still good to be seen just to make sure. If you can be seen before starting treatment, that means clinical trials may be an option. There are trials going on, even in the first line. But in the first line, if you're not on a trial, the treatment works really well. The first line treatment for small cell tends to work great. Where it becomes really important is in the second line. If you're on first line treatment and the cancer grows, you really want to be seen in one of the centers that has clinical trials available. Now, while on first line treatment, while on the first treatment, you can say, hey, I want to see someone just so I'm set up, just so that I know them. And you can't necessarily have a discussion about what specific trials, because hopefully you're not going to need it for a long time, in which case the trials you discuss down the road would be different. But you do want to make sure you have a plan for when it grows, that there's someone you're going to get in with urgently to know your options. And sometimes that is to then go on one of the standard of care where you can continue to be seen by your local oncologist. And I certainly see patients where we'll talk about trials and we'll talk about also the treatment that they can get with their local oncologist. And sometimes that treatment with their local oncologist is the right thing for them. But if you've started a line of therapy, then you don't yet have it. Then clinical trials are kind of not an option in that scenario.
While you're on therapy is not the time to stop educating and learning what your back pocket options might be. And Jacob, what do you say to the person who I've heard he, she over and over again say, I don't want to bother my doctor with that. I'm not gonna, like with what my next options might be, how do you manage that? They're like, oh, he or she is so busy. I don't want to bother them with this.
It's different when talking about it as a topic versus talking to an individual. When talking to an individual, I kind of try to get at what is the reason for that? Why the shying away from this? I mean, look, I'm at work and it's their life. That is not the same thing. And if you have an oncologist that makes you feel like you shouldn't be contacting them, then you have the wrong oncologist. But what will have me awake at night is worrying about the person who doesn't contact me. If someone is going to reach out to me, then I can be a little relieved by that. So I want people to let me know. It's also particularly painful for me if somebody has not reached out and now things have gotten bad enough that they have to be in the hospital or there's something more to manage. I don't want people to have to go through these types of things. So look, the whole point of this is you. The whole point of the work is you. And all of the discussion about the dosing and all of these things, I often tell people, we do all of this so that they can live their life. They don't live their life so that they can be treated for cancer. Now, those inherently are going to be zipped together in a lot of ways, but it's how can I help people kind of get back to their life as much as possible. It'll never be the same. They have the diagnosis. We're not avoiding that, but how do we get back to the other things? But the only way to do that is for them to put the cancer stuff on me, and that's my job, and that's what I want to do for them. So I just can't do my job if they're not reaching out. I want to hear from them. And if for whatever reason you feel like you're not getting that, then maybe you have the wrong team, but more than likely, I think people kind of shy away from it sometimes. It's like, it's been too much. Sometimes there can be guilt around it too, which is the most painful for me to see. So this is your team. And when you show up, that's what gets the best thing for you. And that's what we all want. I feel better when I see patients do better. It hurts me when I see patients not. It's painful to me. I know it's more painful to them and their families, but it affects me and affects the oncologist too, and we want the best, and so we need people to reach out when they need it.
That just sort of touched on some non-clinical advice. What other non-clinical advice would you give someone diagnosed with small cell lung cancer?
First of all, a cancer diagnosis alone, just a cancer diagnosis brings with it a train of expectations and beliefs and all of that. What that diagnosis means, what's going to happen to you, what you're going to look like, what your life is like from that point forward. And not only does it do it for you, it does it for everyone who knows. And so having this diagnosis, sometimes people tell me they feel fine, it's just that everyone keeps treating them like they're sick. And so, if you do feel okay, and everyone's treating you that way, then it becomes this, some people will tell me, I'm constantly counseling others about my diagnosis. So, first and foremost, I'd say when a diagnosis happens, get your feet on the ground, center yourself. You are the same person. You have a diagnosis, but you're the same person. That's not minimizing the diagnosis. I'm not saying it's small, but get your feet on the ground. Get your core group that you can still just be you with. Now there might be individuals that could totally be that. It just requires you interacting with them, close family members that are doing everything they can for you. They just don't know, and they're dealing with it themselves too. Sometimes for family members, it's particularly hard because their whole focus is on their loved one, and so their own processing of stuff isn't happening. So if you get your feet on the ground and you recognize, hey, I still need us to just be us. Communicate that. They might need some processing too. This is all very individual. But create that core and create that trust and be honest with your oncologist. Get a sense of what does this mean. But the only way you can really get a sense of that and retain it is if you get past at least that initial surge of fear that is so disorienting. When you have that, it's hard to really kind of have your feet on the ground. So everything, it's like trying to swim in the middle of a big ocean wave that's crashed. You have to get your bearings first, and it's okay to get your bearings, and it's okay to have all these emotions, and it's okay to have days where you just cry all day. That's okay. That's part of the experience. There's nothing you have to do. There's nothing you should do. This is an individual experience, and you matter. You're valuable. Get your feet on the ground, and ask for what you need. Communicate, and breathe, and just try to slow it all down. And as you do that, you'll get more of a sense of what you need in the process. But you're still you.
So there's a couple of things I want to reiterate. Education and empowerment, really digging deep, or having a family member, a caregiver, a loved one dig deep for you so that you understand your diagnosis. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to talk to your healthcare providers. Like Dr. Sands said, if they don't like you asking questions, they're probably not the right person to be treating you anyway. Go to. We have resources and support for both non-small cell and small cell lung cancer patients. Lean on us. We are here to be extensions of your healthcare team to help with that education, support, and empowerment. And as those of you in the room and many of you online, or those watching later know that have connected with us, know we mean it when we say what Dr. Sands just said. You are not defined by your cancer. You are your own person, right? Know who you are. Second opinions are important, particularly in a lot of the work that we do in our outreach into more rural communities of this country. Folks don't always have access to people like this guy right here, right? That's not to say that there's not a lot of general oncologists and community centers around this country and around the world who aren't fantastic, because there are. But when you're looking at something like a lung cancer diagnosis, it's important that you are with someone who understands what's happening and has their finger on the pulse of what's happening right now. And GoTo can also help to facilitate those second opinions with expert based on your specific diagnosis. So I don't want anyone to forget that either.
No, this is such an important part of getting your feet on the ground.
Yeah.
is having a community you can reach out to, individuals who have been in the work for a long time, to where you can discuss some of that, and that can be really helpful in getting your feet on the ground, getting a sense of things, trusting what that map that you're navigating looks like, so that when you go into the office, you have enough of a sense of things that you can ask questions to get your bearings a bit more. So I think organizations like GoTo are really crucial. They serve an incredible role in this.
Yeah, I agree. We obviously don't give medical advice, but we can help you craft the questions to go back and have those conversations with your healthcare providers so you can make those informed decisions. So thanks for that. Dr. Sands is amazing. I mean, I don't have to tell any of you that. And not all doctors treat the whole person. They don't. I mean, they just don't. And like I said, we talk with folks from around, not just the country, but around the globe, more that never have this type of experience than do. And it saddens me. The things that keep me up at night are that. And in fact, I'm giving a talk on Saturday at the Association for Northern California Oncologists. It's like a Best of ASCO conference, and it's sort of a take on Dr. Weiner's presidential address at ASCO on partnering with patients, because patients are really the cornerstone of care. And I have this whole, because of you, I am ready to come in with some fighting words. Not really, I'm not really going to use fighting words, but to come in with some real world experience based on your experience. My experience, obviously, as you know, with my mom and as a caregiver, but on the experiences that all of you have shared with me, to be able to point back to why it's so important that patients are part. I mean, the answers lie within you, right? Kind of across the board, from how healthcare systems are set up and workflows are set up, right down to patients participating in clinical trials. I mean, you guys hold the key. So I just want to give a huge, huge thank you to all of you, not only for sharing your stories, for participating in the research that's gotten us as far as we've gotten today, because without you, we would not be here. And I don't think people thank you enough. I really don't. Do you have any final?
Well, yeah, one other thing, for clinical trials, I mean, everything is about what is best for you. So when we're talking about trials, that is that a treatment option that is better for you than what exists known today? Now, anytime we're going on a trial, we don't yet really know entirely the outcomes to expect, the side effect profile, depending on where that drug is in development. But consideration of a trial is really as what is best for you. There are trials that we do that are more kind of can we collect some blood because there's something we're studying type of a scenario. But if you're going on a treatment, just know that everything around your care should be around what is best for you. And that really is the point.
Yeah. Agreed. Takeaways. There are options. There are novel treatments and trials. Second opinions with a specialist are always a good idea. And go-to, of course, has small cell specific support and education programs and services tailored to you. I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Jacob Sands for coming all the way out here from Boston. And we want to give a special thanks to our supporters, some of whom specifically went out and did a little bit extra because this is small cell and they are invested in ensuring that these treatment options continue to churn out for the small cell community. Amgen, AstraZeneca, Genentech, Catalyst, and Jazz to start with. And then, of course, Boehringer Ingelheim, Bristol Myers Squibb, Daiichi Sankyo, Eisai, Foundation Medicine, Janssen Oncology, Merck, Mirati Therapeutics, Novartis, Novocure, Regeneron, Sanofi, and Takeda. It's a big, long list of people who really believe in this programming and in all of you. So until next month, everybody have a good night.
So I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're